All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're tackling a really big idea, a framework that supposedly explains how our entire society is put together. But we're not just going to lay it out. We're actually going to put it to the test. We'll use its own logic to see if it really holds up, or if it's got enough teeth to bite back on itself.
So let's start with a little thought experiment. Just imagine this. You're walking through a big open field, and you come across a fence. And there's just no obvious reason for it to be there, right? No animals, no clear property line. It honestly just looks like it's in the way. So what do? Do you just tear it down? Or do you stop for a second and wonder, hey, why did someone go to all the trouble to build this thing? And that single question, well, it gets to the heart of this huge dilemma for anyone who's ever tried to change something. And this whole idea, it's captured in a principle called Chesterton's fence. And it sounds so simple, right? It's just this. Don't ever tear down a fence until you know why it was put up in the first place. And not just why you think it was put up, but the real, actual reason it exists. Now look, this doesn't mean every fence is a good fence. Of course not. It's really an argument about humility, about process. You got to understand first, then you can try to reform. And that idea, well, that's the key that unlocks the whole framework we're digging into today.
So what's this big idea that Chesterton's fence opens the door to? Well, it's a framework, and it's probably most famously connected with Thomas Sowell. And the argument goes something like this. Our oldest rules, our traditions, our institutions, they're not just, old-fashioned relics. They're actually like archives packed with this kind of hidden wisdom. They've encoded generations of trial and error, figuring out what works and what doesn't, often in ways that nobody alive today could even fully explain.
And you can see how this plays out in the real world in some really interesting ways. Just take common law, for example. Think about it. There was no genius committee that sat down in a room and designed the whole thing from scratch. Nope, it just grew, organically. A real fight happens between two people, they go to a judge. The judge looks at what other judges did before and makes a ruling. And boom, that ruling becomes the new precedent. Now multiply that process by millions of cases over hundreds of years, and what you get is a system that has distilled all this practical wisdom from countless real-life situations. It creates something way more complex and sophisticated than any panel of so-called experts could ever dream up from the top down.
And this just perfectly illustrates the main takeaway, right? The wisdom isn't in any one person. It's not in the judge. It's not in the lawyer. The wisdom is baked right into the system itself, the institution, in this case, the common law. It gathers up knowledge that the people inside it can't even fully put into words. It's this amazing mechanism for taking all these scattered bits of experience and weaving them into a coherent working whole over huge spans of time.
Okay, but here's where the rubber really meets the road. It's an elegant idea for sure, but does it always work? What happens when that fence we're looking at is something like, say, racial segregation in housing? Can we honestly say that is an evolved institution that contains some kind of hidden wisdom? This is where we have to put this framework to a really serious test.
And this is really the core of the conflict. On one side, you have the argument that American housing segregation was anything but organic or evolved. No, they say it was a top-down, deliberately designed system forced on people by the government. But the other view, applying Sowell's framework, would suggest that the patterns we see today are mostly just the result of individual choices and different economic realities. So, which one is it? Was this fence a thing that grew over generations, or was it something designed in an office and then hammered into the ground with the full force of the law?
Well, when you actually look at the historical record, the evidence for a top-down design it's pretty powerful. This was not some subtle bottom-up thing. We're talking about the Federal Housing Administration in the 1930s literally drawing red lines on maps to make sure minority neighborhoods couldn't get loans. We're talking about black veterans in the 40s being systematically shut out of the GI Bill benefits that basically built the white middle class. And then you have local zoning laws in the 50s, specifically written to keep certain people out. Let's just be really clear here. These were deliberate, expert-designed, top-down plans, the exact kind of social engineering that the framework itself is supposed to warn us about. But in response to this really strong critique, the framework offers a rebuttal, and it's a super important one. It doesn't actually try to deny any of that history. Instead, it completely reframes the debate by making this very, very sharp distinction, which forces us to ask a totally different set of questions.
Okay, so here's the absolute core of the counterargument. You can, and you absolutely should, acknowledge that redlining was a massive historical injustice. Nobody's arguing that. But, and this is the whole point, that fact, by itself, doesn't automatically mean that any specific policy we come up with today to fix it is actually going to work. The framework insists that we have to treat these as two totally separate questions.
Question 1, was there a past injustice? Question 2, will this specific modern solution actually work without making things worse in some other way? The seriousness of question 1 doesn't give you a free pass on answering question 2.
All right, so we've got this compelling idea about evolved wisdom. And then we have this powerful counterexample, where the framework itself seems to, well, fail its own test. So where does that leave us? The goal here isn't to just pick a winner and say this side is right. The real lesson, the real takeaway, is found in the tension between these two ideas. It's about what this whole stress test actually shows us.
First off, let's just be honest here. The counterargument makes some really solid points. You look at the data on interventions like busing and whether they actually improved education, and frankly, it's a mess. It's genuinely mixed. And the whole idea of separating the historical wrong from whether a modern solution is effective, that's a totally valid and I'd say crucial distinction you have to make. These are serious points. You can't just brush them aside.
But this brings us to what might be the most powerful critique of all, and it really comes down to one word: asymmetry. The framework's core skepticism, right? That rigorous demand for evidence, that worry about unintended consequences, it seems like it's applied unevenly. It's like a laser beam focused on all the potential problems with new reforms, but it's not always as focused on the really deep flaws of the original fence that those reforms were created to fix in the first place.
And this leads us to a really fascinating final thought. The fact that we can actually take this framework, with all its skepticism of top-down planning and its respect for experience, and use it to critique its own application, well, that's maybe the ultimate proof of its value. You see, a good framework isn't some kind of loyalty oath. It's a sharp tool. And the very best tools, they have to be sharp enough to cut the person using them. It doesn't mean the framework is wrong. It actually proves it's real. And it leaves all of us with a pretty important question. How do we apply that same sharp, skeptical tool not just to the things we want to tear down, but also to the things we might be tempted to defend?